I think more important than the buildings and the factories and the, comparatively speaking, greater wealth and comfort is the transformation in the thinking, in the attitudes.
Not many leaders can claim mastery of their own destiny in quite the way Lee Kuan Yew could. I'm Edward Sturton, and over the next half hour, I'll be exploring the way he took a small Asian island and transformed it into one of the richest nations anywhere.
He's a tough guy. He will just say, I do not accept excuses. I only recognize failures.
Under him, Singapore became a model of success that drew politicians from all over the world.
I first went to see Lee Kuan Yew when I had become the leader of the Labour Party, leader of the opposition. And I wasn't disappointed because I went in to see him. I sat down and he said, rather abruptly as he used to be, why have you come to see me? And I said, I want you to tell me how you think I can win and how you think I should govern, which he then did.
His reputation rose with Asia's economies, and he came to stand for the so-called Asian values, which he believed lay behind the region's economic success. But his authoritarian ways earned him detractors as well as admirers.
OK, the courts rarely found against the government. OK, there wasn't much freedom of speech, but a lot of people found it a very good quality of life because of the environment and so on. I think he could have managed without being quite so tough on anybody who had the temerity to disagree with him.
Lee Kuan Yew's long life, he was 91 when he died last week, began in another era. Much of the Asian map was still coloured British imperial red when he was born to Chinese parents in Singapore. They were comfortably off, but not rich, and Lee Chin-koon, his father, was a ferocious disciplinarian. Professor Tom Plate is the author of a book called Conversations with Lee Kuan Yew.
His father was very, very strict. One time his father hung him up over a well because of something he had done wrong and threatened to drop him in. You don't have to have a PhD in psychology to know that that has an effect on you as you grow up and in your relations with other people.
Lee Jr. is said to have been less than close to his father, perhaps unsurprisingly. His relationship with his mother was very different. Father James Minchin, an Australian Anglican priest who worked in Singapore for many years, conducted extensive interviews about the future leader's youth.
The parents had more or less split up from fairly early on in his life, and contact was primarily through his mother, who gave him, as firstborn and first son, a place of prominence in the scheme of things. And even when things were a bit crowded, he usually had a room of his own, a space of his own. And that became the norm. And that pattern of taking very seriously his own needs and wants at any given time and expecting them to be expedited and fulfilled, that was a characteristic that remained with him all his life.
Father James's book, No Man is an Island, has never been sold in Singapore. In 1942, Lee Kuan Yew witnessed what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history.
Japanese transports steam ominously through Asia's troubled waters as Nippon's forces press southward ever closer to Singapore.
This Pathé newsreel must have made miserable viewing in blitz-battered Britain. Singapore surrendered to the Japanese, and some estimates put the number of British, Commonwealth and Imperial troops who were taken prisoner at over 100,000. Lee Kuan Yew's memories of the Japanese occupation were still raw when he gave this interview in the early 1970s.
One of my most vivid memories, within a matter of weeks of their having captured Singapore, was to cycle around one day and see something quite medieval. At every main intersection or bridge, there was a person's head on a wooden block, and on that was written why you, the reader, would join this gentleman whose head was placed on this block unless you cooperated. I think there were about 7, 8 of them.
Lee Kuan Yew would later describe the Japanese occupation as the single most important event of my life. Kishore Mahbubani worked closely with him during his time as Prime Minister and came to know him well.
The Japanese occupation was the most searing experience that he had in his life because it made him aware that you have to make sure that you take care of basic things like human security and ensure that you have the capacity to manage your own destiny and not be a victim of others. So it completely transformed his life, and I think it made him into the strong anti-colonial fighter that emerged after World War II.
Though no friend of British rule, Lee Kuan Yew was such an anglicised figure as a young man that he was almost universally known as Harry. The end of the war allowed him to resume his education with a place at the London School of Economics. He then talked his way into Cambridge, where he read law and was awarded the highest possible degree, a starred first. His future wife, Kwa Geok Chu, was studying there too, and her degree was almost as good as his, almost but not quite.
I think it would have been a source of constant discomfort or embarrassment. The Chinese male is supposed to be the dominant partner. And if you are to be the dominant partner, then you must be the better and the brighter. Unfortunately, they put an asterisk against my name, so, well, that helps.
Every once in a while, you see a young couple and they know that, this is the one. I think that was the case with them. And as marriages go, they go through a period of evolution. She was his best editor. She was his intellectual mate, spiritual mate. The relationship was enduring and close, and it became a tremendous relationship of equals.
Tom Plate. Back in still colonial Singapore in the 1950s, the young lawyer showed real flair for the courts and managed to persuade juries to acquit even when he was privately convinced his client was guilty. Did that make him an admirer of British justice? Far from it.
With regard to the justice system, he felt that slick lawyers, of which he was one, could get, let's just make up an example, OJ off. And so he didn't think that would lead to justice.
I decided when we became the government, we will not allow this foolish, completely incongruous system, which will never take root here, because no juror will take upon himself the onus of saying, yes, he will go to jail.
In the mid-1950s, Lee Kuan Yew was a driving force behind the People's Action Party, and at the end of the decade, he was elected Singapore's first minister. Racial harmony was a central part of his platform. He feared conflict between Chinese and Malay nationalists. He also cracked down on the left with characteristic vigour and secured a second term 4 years later.
After a resounding victory at recent general elections, Singapore's state government was sworn in at City Hall by the head of state, Incha Yusof bin Ishak. First to take the oath of office was the Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, swearing to bear true faith and allegiance to the state and to the Federation of Malaysia.
In the same year as that broadcast on Singapore television, Singapore became part of a federation with its much larger northern neighbour to form the newly independent Malaysia. The merger was at the heart of his plans for the island's future, but he couldn't resist acting as if the Singapore tail should wag the Malaysian dog. James Minchin.
He was determined to make Singapore the centre of Malaysia, and he kept defining Malaysia in terms that he would accept, which was in conflict not only with the sultans and the senior figures in the United Malay National Organization, but also with many of the Chinese in Malaysia, particularly the business community, who saw him as pushing far too hard and creating a very fragile set of relationships.
By August 1965, the tensions between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur had become so serious that divorce became the only option. The press conference at which Lee Kuan Yew announced the parting of the ways carries a sense of high drama even now, half a century later. The hard man of Singapore politics broke down in tears.
You see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. As a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship. Would you mind if we stop for a while?
Professor Tom Plate.
I think it was the last time he teared in public and maybe even in private. I don't know. No, it was 100% genuine because he failed.
I would have edited it because it was, you see, in the scale of values, in Chinese mythology, heroes never cry. Their hearts are broken, but their demeanor is stern. Well, heroes should not cry, and I wasn't a hero.
The end of the Federation did at least give Lee Kuan Yew a free hand in his campaign to transform Singapore.
I probably first met him face-to-face or shook hands with him when he came to the University of Singapore, I think in 1969.
Kishore Mahbubani has since become a public intellectual with a global reputation and is one of Lee Kuan Yew's greatest champions.
He's very tough.
And do you think that toughness was necessary, was needed to do the job of transforming Singapore?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, Singapore was a very chaotic third world country, you know. So when I grew up, for example, you could pay bribes and get exam papers. You could buy driving licenses. There was litter. There were gangsters. Gangsters would chase each other with cut beer bottles and cut each other up, you know. To suddenly change that place and to make it one of the most orderly places in the universe takes a very tough will and tough mind.
Ever feel you'd like to fly away on a holiday to get away from it all? What about Singapore, for instance? It's a city of contrasts. On the one hand, there are the modern tourist hotels. And on the other, the bustle of Eastern trading and bargaining in Change Alley. Singapore, a crossroads between East and West, a place of picturesque romance and charm.
In 30 years, Lee Kuan Yew took Pathé's crossroads between East and West and transformed it, as the title of one of his books put it, from third world to first. In 1965, income per head was the same as that in the West African state of Ghana. Today, Singapore, in proportion to the size of its population, earns more than the United Kingdom. The model wasn't quite pure capitalism. The state retained a big role in directing the economy. The senior British Conservative Chris Patten came to know Lee Kuan Yew well during his time as governor of Hong Kong.
He dealt with corruption by being very tough on those who were corrupt. Same thing happened, incidentally, in Hong Kong, but also, as happened in Hong Kong, by paying public servants a lot of money. I don't think he ever really liked businessmen. He tolerated businessmen, but I think he found the business of making money slightly vulgar. He was an extraordinarily intelligent man, interested in ideas, recognized that markets were the best way of creating wealth, but didn't really like the process.
Lee Kuan Yew once suggested, with characteristic bluntness, that there was a choice between becoming another Palestine or another Switzerland. His determination to secure the second of those options earned him the admiration of the world's bankers. Mervyn Davies came to admire him during his time as the chief executive of Standard Chartered. Lord Davies sent us this tribute.
I had the privilege during my time at Standard Chartered of meeting Lee Kuan Yew on many, many occasions in Singapore and elsewhere. I think when we look at the emergence of Asia and the different countries within Asia, history will look back on Lee Kuan Yew as having had a profound impact on the emergence not just of Singapore as a regional hub and as a centre of excellence, but also in the emergence of Asia, and I would argue to the emerging markets internationally.
He made Singapore attractive for multinationals up to a point. He was rigid on the issue of commercial law, that if you were a British company and you came in, or an American company, the playing field would be level, that there wouldn't be favoritism in the law for local firms. But he also did something that wasn't so obvious back then, and that was, given the small size of Singapore's population, by, in effect, liberating women in a Chinese Confucian culture to have equal opportunity to education and to jobs. And that was a phenomenal revolutionary decision on his part. And he felt without a quality labor force, what would be the incentive for people to come in to Singapore?
Tom Plate. The model seemed to work so well that Lee Kuan Yew became something of an international guru, the go-to geopolitical thinker for aspiring leaders, even those from Singapore's former colonial master. The future Prime Minister Tony Blair went to see him after being elected leader of the British Labour Party.
He described government as a process of executive decision-making rather than ideology. And so I asked him a whole lot of questions about why he'd governed Singapore in the way he had, how he made certain decisions and why he made them, and he explained it to me. But he explained it to me very much in terms of, I wanted to decide to do what would work for Singapore.
A real pragmatist, in fact.
He was a complete pragmatist, which is not to say he didn't have very strong principles, but his view about Singapore, and you can see this reflected in decisions like it's important to learn English, like let's import the best intellectual capital from around the world and help the country grow. These were decisions where he was overriding sort of emotional or popular or ideological sentiment in the cause of doing what he thought would make the country more successful.
That pragmatism was central to what some believe was Lee Kuan Yew's most enduring achievement. In November 1978, the Chinese Communist leader Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore and was much taken by what he saw. Professor Tom Plate argues the visit was a critical moment on China's journey to becoming the economic hyperpower we know today.
Maybe his greatest success outside of Singapore was to lure Deng Xiaoping to the idea that China had an economic system that was a disaster and had to be changed with rapidity. And I think he felt that his conversations with Deng Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping's visit to Singapore was very instrumental in Deng Xiaoping making one of the great U-turns in history, and one of the reasons why Lee Kuan Yew believes that in the second half of the 20th century, the greatest leader in the world was Deng Xiaoping. He was a great man.
I think that was one of his great achievements for the world, because he was obviously Asian himself and proud of it. He was an absolute meritocrat. He was an Asian. And what he showed the Chinese was that you could improve your economy without conceding your essential cultural dignity or identity. And that, I think, was very important for the Chinese.
Tony Blair. There was, of course, a dark side to all this. The banning of chewing gum is perhaps the most famous example of Lee Kuan Yew's determination to control every aspect of Singapore life, but there were much more serious restrictions on freedoms and human rights. Trial by jury was abolished, criminals faced punishment by caning, and opposition leaders complained that they were denied a fair shot at power. Chris Patton.
Newspapers or journals which criticised him or criticised Singapore were usually hounded out of Singapore, and I think it was unnecessary, because the success of Singapore spoke for itself. Okay, some of the democratic structures were pretty Potemkin. Okay, the courts rarely found against the government. Okay, there wasn't much freedom of speech, but a lot of people found it a very high standard of living, a good quality of life because of the environment and so on. I think he could have managed without being quite so tough on anybody who had the temerity to disagree with him.
If you judge it by standards of the Britain of the 1950s, then definitely it's very high a price. But if you judge it in the context of Singapore and Southeast Asia, then I say it's a very, very mild system. We have about 60 political detainees. We let them loose. It'll be a much more exciting time in Singapore with a few more bombs exploding.
Even his policies on law and order, which were very controversial, but he decided that absolutely axiomatic to building a successful Singapore was to make it a safe place for people to walk the street.
Did you talk to him at all about that? Because obviously there were sort of the trivial things like ban on chewing gum, but there were more serious things like caning, like a suppression, really, of a properly free press as we would understand it. Did you discuss that with him at all?
Yes, and obviously there would be points of difference where our society would always be different from his, but as well as the points of difference, I would talk to him about law and order particularly, because I think he was onto something there, which then became later something that I think developed societies started to realize they led a disintegration in order and security for the ordinary citizen, made people unhappy with the way their local community functioned. And he understood right from the very beginning the importance of that. He also, by the way, was a passionate advocate of community integration. And one of the things that Singapore did in its housing program, and this was very much his idea, was to insist that their different faith and cultural communities had to be living together. They were not allowed to end up with separate ghettos of housing for this community or that community. And this was also a very important part of the success story.
Tony Blair. Lee Kuan Yew supporters like Kishore Mahbubani see this controversy in terms of the broader question of whether Asia's economic challenge to the West is echoed in an Asian challenge to Western political ideas and institutions.
It's a subject that will be much debated in history. And of course, the Western theory is that you can achieve everything you did without necessarily having to use strong, unpleasant means. But as you saw, after 9/11 happened, it's amazing that the United States of America, which used to criticize Mr. Lee Kuan Yew for detaining people without trial, did exactly the same thing and did it much worse, because in Singapore, we didn't have the kind of torture that you had in Guantanamo. So the fact that the United States is one of its main critics did that, demonstrated that in a crisis, people have to use difficult methods.
Lee Kuan Yew finally stepped down as Singapore's leader in 1990, but he remained in the cabinet, and when his eldest son became Prime Minister in 2004, Lee Kuan Yew was elevated to the role of Minister Mentor. Kishore Mahbubani again.
I've had the good fortune of shaking hands with, I guess, what you might call world leaders, whether it's Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Chancellor Kohl, Francois Mitterrand. And I was present at the meetings that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had with them. And I was amazed about the deference that they would show to him and how much they would listen to him. Because if the biggest countries in the world would listen to him and follow his advice, you knew that that would change the course of world history.
What was it that made them listen to him?
Well, he was intellectually brilliant. I mean, the thing about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is that virtually of all the leaders that I have met, his IQ was far higher than that of most of the world leaders. And whenever he spoke, he never indulged in small talk or small chatter. He would cut to the chase and get to the point and not get sidetracked by anything else.
Not everyone was seduced. During his time as Hong Kong's last British governor, Chris Patten became an outspoken critic of the concept of Asian values, which was so closely associated with Lee Kuan Yew's standing, and the two publicly crossed swords.
I think he was a great leader of Singapore. What I don't buy is his role as a great philosopher king. Take Asian values and the justification which he suggested Asian values gave for a lack of democracy in Asia. What sorts of government are there in Asia? You go from tyranny to totalitarian to soft authoritarian to guided democracy to full-scale democracy. You have every sort of government and some very good examples of vigorous democracies. So to say that there is something called Asian values, which is reflected perhaps principally in the way Singapore is governed, is, I think, preposterous.
The Asian values debate is unfortunately very distorted in the Western discourse about it. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew never said that Asian values are superior to other values. For example, he believed that Western rule of law was essential for all societies, and he would defend it stoutly. But at the same time, he would emphasize, especially at the end of the Cold War, when the United States and the West became very arrogant and somewhat condescending towards the rest of the world, he was saying, do not imagine that the rest of the world can be remade to suit your prescriptions and dreams and so on and so forth. Other societies have different values and will progress differently, and history has proven him right.
Kishore Mahbubani. Lee Kuan Yew's final years were marred by the loss of the one person who could stand up to him, his wife, the Anglican priest and biographer, Father James Minchin.
In the last few years, the 5 years of his wife's decline, and in the period since her death, he would develop the practice of meditating. He found that very calming and soothing because he just couldn't cope with the reality. She was a kind of anchor, the center of his sense of emotional stability, as his mother had been in a more diffuse way as he grew up.
Our top stories. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's first Prime Minister and a towering figure in Asian politics, has died at the age of 91.
Outside the presidential palace in Singapore, people are gathering to pay their respects. Across the globe, leaders are paying tribute to Lee Kuan Yew. President Obama in the US describing him as a true giant of history. Preparations are now being made for his funeral.
There was real grief in Singapore at Lee Kuan Yew's passing. Even his opponents recognise the scale of his achievement there. But will the Singapore miracle survive without him? The city-state so closely reflects the personality of the man who created it that even his most fervent supporters accept that's not an easy question to answer.
The bad news about Singapore is that it is a small state and therefore it will always face a challenging existence. But the good news about Singapore is that it is aware that it is a small state. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has embedded in the Singapore elite a sense of paranoia about the future and a belief that you always have to continue worrying if you're going to survive. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths that Singapore has today.
Lee Kuan Yew's life was marked above all by a determination to control his own destiny and, if he could, that of everyone around him. But when he was asked about his legacy in that 1970s interview, even he accepted that a time would come for him to let go.
The eastern side of me says that I will be somewhere watching. I think the problem is I don't quite believe that. So if you ask me what hereafter, I say I don't know. But if I feel that my friends and even my enemies say he did his best, I think if there is a soul somewhere floating in outer space, I feel that I have vindicated what I tried to do.